All right. So, before we get going, just want a couple things to mention off the top. So, module 5 and 6, you've got those practice problems, the answers, and the solution key. So, after we get done with class today, I will have that module 5-6 quiz kind of set to release. So, everything this week, module 5 and 6, module 7 quizzes will be due at the end of the day on Sunday, as well as all the participation quizzes from this week will be due at the end of the day Sunday, so July 13th. Then next week, on Monday, we'll finish module 7. The quiz for that will be posted. We'll cover modules. Oh, sorry, we'll finish module 8 on Monday. We'll then kind of do module 9 on Tuesday, Wednesday, have the quiz for module 9 posted. Those will be due by the end of the day Thursday, because we have that second exam next Friday. So things are moving quick here. I will also, just like I did for exam 1, post up under the files tab, just like we had, where is it at? Exam 1 materials, I'll put exam 2, I'll put up a practice exam. Obviously, I didn't want to overwhelm anyone and kind of put it up there. I mean, you can start looking at it early, so I wanted to kind of get that out to you quick, but I didn't want to post it and have people think, oh my gosh, is the exam this week or something. So want to lay that out today. So you'll see that exam 2 materials folder pop up with practice, a practice exam and the answer key in there as well. Other than that, from yesterday, please make sure, I know the due date's set to be the 13th, but that participation quiz from yesterday is the one where we're testing out that Respondus lockdown browser. You may have to download it if you haven't already had it on your computer. So we want to make sure we can kind of get that quiz completed with the lockdown browser. I won't apply it to any of the other participation quizzes this week, so I'll publish this one right now. It's just that one, I want to make sure we kind of get that working so we can use that lockdown browser for next week's exam, okay? Any other questions for me before we dive into material here? Okay. All right. So, oh, I forgot to open this up. So, we left off, I think on our slide 21. There we go. So, we talked about price ceilings, price floors. Another easy one that, or I shouldn't say easy, but what might seem easier is instead of a price control, the government might come in and set a quota, right? And just say that there can't be a certain, more than a certain quantity in the market. So if I had, gallons of milk here, if I'm trying to help out the dairy industry, maybe I, instead of allowing there to be 500, the equilibrium quantity gallons of milk out there, I said there can only be 400 units. If I limit quantity, right, we're going to start to have differences in the price that a consumer pays, right? And then you can kind of think about it as the price the seller would be willing to, or sorry, the price the consumer would be willing to pay and the price the seller would be willing to sell it at. So I have a depiction here. It's actually a little bit inaccurate in a way. So if we set this quota, we're not allowing the market to get to this higher equilibrium quantity. Where is the dead weight loss going to come from? So I'll draw this out for us here. So let's say we've got a market, just more generally, and I've got my supply curve, and I've got my demand curve. Whatever that equilibrium quantity is, the government comes in and says, there can't be any more than this quantity in the market. So just like with price ceilings and price subsidies, where does that dead weight loss come from? It comes from the fact that we're no longer seeing these units provided to the market. What was the economic surplus before, not producer consumer, but just the total economic surplus? Well, that would be the difference between the market's marginal benefits and the market's marginal costs. So this area here would be all of the surplus lost from the fact that these units are no longer being sold. Okay, so that's about the extent on a quota which I would ask you questions, is that the new quantity is going to be lower, where dead weight loss is going to be. What actually gets a little bit more difficult is when we're thinking about producer and consumer surplus with a quota, because how much would the consumer be willing to pay for this last unit? So the consumer would pay whatever their marginal benefit was. So we kind of think about this as the price that the consumer would be willing to pay. However, the seller would be willing to sell that unit for anything above their marginal cost. So we have this range of prices where we don't really know where the price is going to fall, right? Now, more often than not, in these markets where the government is protecting industries with a quota, generally companies are always going to have a little bit of market power or have a little more market power than consumers. Now, we're really assuming a perfectly competitive market here, so we don't know that, right? Unless we know more about the specifics of whatever market we're looking at. So the price really could, like, you kind of think about the consumer and the seller, they could come to an agreement at any price in this range. So we don't really know where that new equilibrium price is going to fall. Generally, we would think about the price on the market is going to be whatever consumers are willing to pay because companies have a little bit more power. So there, what would consumer surplus be? The area above the price they now pay, below their demand curve. So consumer surplus relative to when it was in equilibrium is now smaller. And then kind of similar to taxes, generally, what's the price that sellers are now selling this on the market for? Up here. So what's their producer surplus? The difference between that and their supply curve or their marginal cost. So typically we would see then producer surplus from these quotas actually go up, as long as those companies have some market power. But what could occur is, what if the consumers had some more power in this market? Then the price tends to be a little bit closer to that price, that the last price the sellers were willing to pay, and then consumer surplus would go up. So when it comes to quotas, it's a little bit more tricky or difficult to really say what's going to happen to producer and consumer surplus. We don't know which one is going to increase or decrease. We know that for sure deadweight loss will be created, but I wouldn't ask you about necessarily a consumer producer surplus question related to a quota. All right. Any questions on that idea? And if we have time at the end, maybe I'll kind of revisit this and show you what happens if the consumers have power. But I want to save time for the stuff that I know they'll be asking you questions on. Okay. All right. So we've got this quota. The next thing we're going to talk about, government actions, are going to be taxes and then subsidies. So with taxes, we'll focus on those a little more than subsidies. That'll be the bulk of today. So why do we pay taxes? Well, it generates money for the government to then pay for what we call public goods. So things like roads, police, schools, etc. So we think that these products, no one person is going to, well, I shouldn't say no one person. Most economies, there wouldn't be very many people who just build their own school and then allow people to go there for free, right? So we need to collect money to pay for them. We've got all kinds of taxes, right? You're probably familiar with some of them. Sales tax is the one all of us, pay every time we buy something. But there's corporate taxes, income taxes you have to pay every single year. We could go through the list here, but there's plenty more that I didn't name, right? So the type of tax we're specifically going to talk about, because we're interested in how this tax is going to impact different products or the market for different products, is going to be called an excise tax, right? So this is going to be a tax on a specific good. Now this could be a sales tax, right? Every good would have whatever the state sales tax is. But we also see taxes put on specific products, like there's a gasoline tax, right? Production of gasoline, you have to pay a certain amount per gallon. Maybe tobacco, right? We're trying to discourage people from buying cigarettes, so we put a tax on packs of cigarettes or tobacco products, alcohol, etc. So we're going to be thinking about these types of excise taxes or sales taxes. The other taxes will work very similar, but we're not going to be focusing so much on like the market for labor here with income. We're thinking more about the product for goods. So sales tax and excise taxes are what we're going to think about. And then we'll eventually talk about tax incidence, right? So this refers to who is going to bear the burden of a tax. So will consumers be hurt more by a tax, or will producers? So these are all things that we'll talk about here as we cover taxes. So here's like the basic example of how you would, if you tax a product, we're generally going to see losses in that market, okay? So let's say I'm thinking about buying a used car, and I find the used car I want, and it's $11,000. Right? Matt is willing to sell this car for $10,000, right? So this individual is willing to pay up to $11,000. Matt's willing to pay $10,000. They can come to an agreement somewhere in between, right? They might have to haggle back and forth, but $10,500. Well, that's less than David was willing to pay, more than Matt was willing to sell, so they could come to an agreement there. What if there is a, whoops, and I just chose these numbers to make it a little bit easier to kind of think about, but if I had a 15% sales tax on used cars. So let's just assume that Matt is feeling generous and says, you know what, David, I know you need this used car. I'll sell it to you for 10,000. I was willing to sell it for 10,000. I'm okay with that. David was willing to pay 11. He'll definitely pay 10. However, once he pays that $10,000, now he also has to pay an additional 15% sales tax. So the total cost is going to be, well, what is 10,000 times 0.15? Oh, this is not the right number here. There we go. That math looks a little bit better, right? So 10,000 times 0.15 would be 1,500. So that would get added into the total price that David's paying, right? He gives 10,000 to Matt, 1,500 to the government. Is he willing to pay 11,500 for this car? No. So because there's this sales tax, even at that very lowest price that Matt was willing to sell his car at, we now see that this transaction won't occur. All right, so this is a very basic example of, well, if there's a tax, there would have been a used car, if you think about it, it's kind of weird, but produced and consumed in this market that no longer is. So we're going to see in the market, there's a reduction in quantity. What happens if we get a reduction in quantity from our equilibrium because of a government action? Dead weight loss. Okay. So we can kind of think about first, what if we had taxes on the sellers of a certain product? Okay. So if we tax producers or the people who are selling something, so this might be like every pack of cigarettes that is produced, there's a $1 tax on that, right? So before, maybe the price was $4, right? That was the current equilibrium price, and the current equilibrium quantity of packs of cigarettes sold was 1,000. So before consumer surplus, we did this last class, the area above that price, but below the demand curve. Producer surplus, the area below that price, but above our supply curve. Less technical, we said producer surplus is always in the bottom, consumer surplus on top. If we instead, so total surplus is the sum of those two. If we have a tax, essentially what we're doing is if the supply curve represents the marginal cost to produce something, well, whatever the marginal cost was before, it still is going to cost the producer that much, but now they have to pay this additional $1 tax on each pack of cigarettes. So at every quantity, the marginal cost has went up by $1. So this looks like a what? A decrease in supply. So with this tax, the actual price that sellers would need, or the price where they're first willing to supply that good to the market, is now going to be higher. So what is true now, every quantity in this range, the price that the consumer is willing to pay, their marginal benefit, is now below the price that the seller requires in order to provide or produce or sell that product. So we're not going to see any of these units sold anymore. Our new kind of equilibrium would be where the supply curve plus the tax hits our demand curve. That's the price that consumers or buyers are going to pay. However, if there's a $1 tax on a pack of cigarettes, I sell it and make $4.50. How much do I actually keep? Well, I have to give $1 of that to the government. So even though the price the consumer pays is going to be higher, the price the seller keeps is going to be that -1. Notice the price the seller keeps is now lower than the old equilibrium price. So this tax is going to hurt both consumers and producers. It raises the price that consumers are paying, lowers the price that sellers are keeping, and so we know that both of them are going to be hurt. So now where is producer and consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus, the area above the price they pay, but below this demand curve, is going to be right here. Producer surplus, the area below the price that they're selling the good for, or how much I shouldn't say that they're selling it for, how much they get to keep, would be below that new price of $3.50, but above the supply curve. So notice, compared to before, producer and consumer surplus have both decreased. Lights turn off even quicker than they usually do. Sorry. So what is all this area in the middle? This isn't all going to be dead weight loss, right? Deadweight loss, just like with the quota, is only going to come from the fact that we're no longer seeing these 250 units sold. So the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost, or the supply and demand curve in that market, this would represent our deadweight loss here, this red area. This area in the middle is not deadweight loss. These units are being sold. So after the tax, there's 750 units being sold. On every single pack of cigarettes, how much money is the government making? $1. So the height of that rectangle will always be the difference between the price that the consumer pays and the seller keeps, and that difference will always be the tax. So if I take the value of the tax times the number of units, that would be the area of this rectangle. That's government tax revenue. Okay. So if we tax the producers, it's going to shift that supply curve. We end up with consumer and producer surplus decrease. We create some deadweight loss, but we've also generated some tax revenue. So when we talk now about total surplus, it's not just consumer plus producer. We now have government surplus as well, right? Government surplus is just tax revenue, right? Any questions on that before I keep moving here? So what if instead we started out with this equilibrium price and quantity, but I tax the consumers of a good? So this is a little bit weird, but if I tax the consumer, their benefit will be whatever it was before, but now they have to pay an additional dollar to the government to buy this good. So it's whatever their marginal benefit was before minus, right, that tax. So at every quantity, the marginal benefit would actually be $1 lower, or we would have this decrease, in demand. So if we tax the producers, we saw a supply decrease. If we tax consumers, we see a demand decrease. What is the result of this demand decrease? Well, our new quote unquote equilibrium price is now down here. This will be the price that we see for the good in the market. It's going to be lower than the old equilibrium. But what's the total price? So that's the price that, sellers get to keep. What's the total price that the consumer pays? So if I go in and I have to pay for something and there's sales tax, well, that's the tax on the consumer, right? That's an additional amount added to my bill. So I'll hand over $3.50 to the producer, but I also have to pay this additional sales tax or excise tax here if it was on the consumers of $1. So the total price I actually end up paying is whatever I give to the company plus the value of that tax. So now here, the price the seller keeps is still less than the old equilibrium, and the price the consumer pays is now higher than the old equilibrium. Once again, we've seen both producers and consumers hurt by this tax. But this same tax on consumers would also create tax revenue, right? The difference between the price the consumer pays, total price they pay, and the price the sellers keep, that's the value of the tax, times the quantity after the tax, that's tax revenue. And then we would still see this number of units, 250 units no longer being sold. So the area between our supply and demand curve that we are missing out on now, that would be our deadweight loss. So we get the exact same effects if we have a tax on consumers or if we have a tax on producers. Right? Okay. Oops. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So just another way of thinking about this, right? Kind of where is all this surplus going, or these changes in surplus? And I'll create a shorthand here in a second that kind of gives you a summary of all these. Actually, let's just do that now. No, let's do this first and then I'll do that. So here we kind of started out, and if our market was in equilibrium, here was the total economic surplus, A, B, C, D, E, and F. If we have this tax, right, we said it doesn't matter if it was on consumers or producers, it's going to raise the price that the consumer pays, lower the price that sellers get to keep. So this area A would now be consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve, but above the price that consumers pay. So their surplus, they lost out on what? B and E, right? Consumer surplus before, the area above that equilibrium price, but below the demand curve was this entire triangle. So consumers lose surplus here and here. Producers, their new surplus is the area below the new price that they get to keep, no longer the old equilibrium price, but above their supply curve. So they've lost out these two areas of surplus. What is B and C? Well, B, right, we know this entire rectangle represents, so what's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps? That's the value of the tax. So here is our tax revenue. B represents tax revenue that used to be consumer surplus. C represents tax revenue that used to be producer surplus. And then area E and F would represent consumer and producer surplus that is just lost. Right? So when we tax these products, yes, we can generate some tax revenue, and that might benefit people who are using schools and things like that. But whatever the market we tax, whatever good we tax, there the consumers and producers in that market are going to be hurt. Okay, we're going to have a loss of consumer and producer surplus, and we're going to have a loss overall in total economic surplus as well. Okay. So just a different way of kind of looking at that. I'll also then kind of do a shorthand and give you a visual of how generally I would think about taxes. So if you're drawing out these taxes, it can be on consumers or producers, but because you get the same implications or the same result no matter who the tax is on, I think that if I was drawing out a graph for any problem related to taxes, I would always think about it as a tax on producers. I think that that's easier because really, what does the supply curve represent? It's the marginal cost to produce something. Right? So if we had our old equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, when we have a tax on a product, it's essentially like adding in an additional cost. So we said that at every quantity, the cost is now higher, or it's like a supply decrease. So this is like the supply curve plus this additional cost, right? I have the marginal cost is whatever it was before plus this tax. This allows me to then identify the new equilibrium. So I'll sometimes kind of notate this as, and here I probably shouldn't have used red, but it doesn't really matter. The price that we see in the market, which is here, the price that the consumer is going to pay. Now, that's the price that we see handed over from the consumer, but the producer has to pay that tax, so they don't get to keep all of it. How much do they get to keep? Well, the price the seller keeps is going to be the price the consumer pays minus the tax. So notice here, the price that the seller keeps will be the price the consumer pays minus the tax. So that's why that difference, if I just rearrange this a little bit, the difference in between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps, that'll always represent the value of the tax. Okay. And then what's my new quantity after the tax? Right here. That's why if we take the value of the tax times the quantity after the tax, that would just represent kind of government tax revenue here. That was this area in the middle. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. So we said both consumers and producers are going to see a decrease in surplus. But is that decrease the same? Okay. I'm going to draw out some extreme examples to kind of show what we call tax incidence, right? So incidence just means who is bearing more of the burden. That's kind of the phrase I will typically use. So when we have these taxes, who is going to bear more of the burden of the tax? So I'll use an extreme example, two extreme examples to kind of help us, I think, solidify the general principle of who is going to bear more of the burden. So let's say I've got, which one do I want to do first here? So we'll do apply, representing my marginal costs. We'll do a completely vertical demand curve. Okay. So if I had a completely vertical demand curve, right, what would we say demand is here? Perfectly what? inelastic, right? You change the price, they're going to keep buying the exact same amount, right? So here would be my equilibrium quantity. Supply equals demand here. Here's my equilibrium price. If I have a tax in this market, intuitively, if consumers don't respond at all to price changes, they keep buying the same amount. If you don't respond to something, generally, you bear more of the burden. I always use the example when I have people in class. If I were to throw, I don't know, let's say I don't know, took my phone and just threw it out at you guys. And there's two people standing next to each other. Who's going to bear the burden of me throwing that phone? Well, whoever moves out of the way, whoever responds, doesn't bear the burden. Whoever is inelastic, doesn't respond at all, they're going to get hit in the head with that phone, right? So whoever is not responding to this change in price, whoever is more inelastic, generally they bear more of the burden. So whoever is more inelastic, we would say they're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Okay? So how can we see this play out with a perfectly inelastic demand curve? So if I've got a tax that looks like a decrease in supply, before, it's kind of weird, but what would have been my producer surplus before? So producer surplus would have been the area below the equilibrium price, but above my supply curve. So it would have been this entire area here. Okay. After the tax, what's the new price on the market? It's now going to be where supply hits demand. So the price the consumer pays, we can kind of think about that's like the price in the market. What's the price the seller keeps? The price the consumer pays minus the tax. So notice the price the seller keeps will be the same as the old equilibrium price. So what has happened to producer surplus? Well, producer surplus after the tax is the exact same area. They weren't impacted at all. Why? Because demand was perfectly inelastic. They didn't respond at all. It gets kind of weird, but what would have consumer surplus have been before? It's the area above price, but below the demand curve. So here it would have been like this was consumer surplus before. What is consumer surplus after? Only this area here. So consumers lost all of this surplus. What did that become? Well, it's the new quantity after the tax, which it doesn't change because consumers were perfectly inelastic. All of this area would represent a loss of consumer surplus that went to the government, or what's the difference between the price the seller keeps and the consumer pays? The value of the tax times the quantity after the tax. That would be tax revenue. So with perfectly inelastic demand, who bore more of the burden, right? Well, consumers bore the entire burden, of that tax. Producers weren't hurt at all. Okay. So with this in mind, we'll look at the other extreme. So let's think about if I had perfectly elastic demand, right? So I've got my supply curve. I've got perfectly elastic demand, right? So whenever I've got consumers are perfectly elastic, they're going to be responding way more than producers, right? Because the response is like the infinite, right? So where was the old quantity? Okay, so here we've got old equilibrium quantity, old equilibrium price. If I see a tax, same tax as we had before, but now demand is perfectly elastic, what's the new price on the market? Well, it actually ends up being the exact same as the old equilibrium price. So the price the consumer pays is up here. How much does the seller keep? The seller only keeps whatever the consumer pays minus that tax. And we are going to see now the quantity after this tax goes down. Okay. So kind of a weird example, but when we have perfectly inelastic demand, what was deadweight loss here? Surplus is actually, total surplus is still the same. So when you have perfectly inelastic demand, deadweight loss is 0. If you have instead perfectly elastic demand, well, now we're missing out on all of this surplus that we would have had before. What's consumer surplus? So once again, this is a weird one, but what's the difference between the price and the demand curve? In both scenarios, it's just this line. So consumer surplus with perfectly elastic demand would be zero. What's happened to producer surplus? Well, before, producer surplus would have been the area underneath this price, but above our supply curve. So it would have been this entire area. After that tax, the new price that they get to keep is down here. So producer surplus after the tax has went down quite a bit. So when consumers were perfectly elastic, they didn't have any loss of surplus. Who had all the loss of surplus? That would be producers, right? And then this area in the middle here, this is what used to be producer surplus, but is now what? The quantity of the tax after the tax times the tax. This would represent government tax revenue. Okay, so kind of think about this area here. That rectangle represents tax revenue. Okay, so when demand was perfectly elastic, they didn't bear any of the burden of the tax because they were responding completely to that price change. If you have perfectly inelastic demand, well, then you're not responding at all. You're going to bear the entire burden, right? So kind of using those two extremes to kind of think about who's bearing the burden of the tax. In general, we're not going to have perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic demand, or we're not going to have, we could do a similar thing with perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic supply. What's going to end up being true is whoever is more inelastic, supply or demand, they're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. And then whoever is more elastic, they're more responsive, they're going to bear less of the burden. Okay. So we know how to calculate elasticities. We can determine who is more or less elastic. So I think here, and I'll kind of come back to this here in a second. I wanted to go, oh, where is it at? Here we go. So I kind of already did this for us. We kind of worked through perfectly inelastic demand. And I even showed you perfectly elastic demand, as well. So let's look at something that's kind of like in the middle, okay? So here I've got this example where I've got supply and demand. I have a tax on this good. I can calculate the elasticities of supply and demand, but I can also look at the prices relative to the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps relative to the old equilibrium price to tell me who's going to bear more of the burden. So that's kind of what this has set up. So if I think about who's going to pay more of the tax, well, I can look at the difference between the price that the consumer pays and the old equilibrium price. So let's say I had that $1 tax from before. If the difference between the price, the old equilibrium price of 4, and the consumer now is paying, I don't know, I think $4.75, they're going to bear 3/4 of that, right? Now, the old equilibrium price minus the price the seller keeps, that's going to tell me how much less the sellers get to keep. So whichever of these is larger, that's going to be who's bearing more of the burden. That means they must have been more inelastic. Okay. So let me shorthand this here. If I'm thinking about price the consumer pays after the tax minus that old equilibrium price. And then I'm going to compare that to the old equilibrium price minus the new lower price that sellers get to keep. So if this difference, in my example, was like 0.75 and 0.25, right, that makes up the $1 tax. If the amount that the consumer pays goes up by more than what the seller, how much the seller gets to keep goes down, we would say here that consumers are more inelastic. Why? Because they're bearing more of the burden of that tax. If it was like flipped, let's say the difference looks something like this, well, then the amount that the sellers keep is going down by more than the increase that the consumers are paying. Here we would say that consumers would actually be the ones who are more elastic. They're bearing less of the burden of that overall $1 tax. Okay. So we can look at a visual for this, which is right here. So in this example, right, I've got, I think, gasoline instead of cigarette taxes. So here was the old equilibrium price of $1.50. After that tax, the new price consumers pay is going to be $2.25. How much will the sellers keep? Well, I know it'll be this amount minus that $1 tax. So we kind of kept this as a dollar tax. So the sellers keep $1.25. How much more are consumers paying than they were before? 75 cents. How much less are sellers getting to keep? 25 cents. So here consumers are bearing more of the burden, which tells us they were actually more inelastic. Okay. If I go back to my earlier example, who was bearing more of the burden in this example? It's kind of a weird one. Well, the amount that consumers paid went up by 50 cents. Sellers kept 50 cents less. Here we would have the exact same elasticity. They're bearing the burden of this tax equally. In this example, they weren't. So we know that it must have been consumers because they were bearing more of the burden of that $1 tax. They must have been more inelastic. They weren't as responsive. Okay. Excuse me. And then I've got some calculations here, like we could find deadweight loss, right? Just kind of the difference between, right? Here's my area of my triangle. Tax revenue would be this purple area. We'll kind of work through some problems here in a second with some actual values, so I won't waste too much time on that right now. But basically, the end of this, the result of all of this is who is going to bear more of the burden? Whoever is more inelastic. Okay. Now, the difference in those prices can tell me who is bearing more of the burden, who's going to be more inelastic or elastic. But I could also just look at actual elasticity measures, right? We know how to calculate those. So let's say I had an elasticity of demand that was 3.9 and the elasticity of supply is 1.7. So in this example, both consumers and producers are elastic, right? In absolute value, these are both greater than 1. Who is more elastic? Who has the higher elasticity measure? That would be consumers. So if they're more elastic, they're going to bear less of the burden. Suppliers or producers are more inelastic, so they would be bearing more of that burden. Okay. And then, if this was flipped, right, where consumers were actually less elastic or more inelastic, they're going to bear more of the burden. Okay. So when we actually have the actual elasticity values, this is, I think, pretty easy. But even if we didn't, we could tell who is more inelastic by whoever is kind of paying, whoever's new price is further away from the old equilibrium price. In this case, that would have been consumers. So they're bearing more of the burden. That tells us they must be more inelastic. Okay. Or that their elasticity is less than that of supply. Okay. We already worked through the extreme. So we'll kind of work on calculating some areas, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time to go through subsidies. So with some actual values here, and I think this is going to be the same grid lines that I used last class for price ceilings, price floors. Notice, what is consumer surplus before and after this tax? Well, the old equilibrium price is 50. The area above that, below the demand curve, would be this triangle. So 40 times a half. Producer surplus, this lower triangle. So once again, 40 times a half. Producer and consumer surplus both start at 800. After that tax, where is the new price consumers pay? Well, that's actually going to be up here at 60. So notice I could use like a price ceiling, a price floor to raise that price to 60, or I could use a tax. Now, the difference is that when I use a tax, this is the new price that consumers pay. So consumer surplus is now going to be the area below demand, but above this new price they pay. So this little triangle here, so 30 times a half. So consumer surplus went down. Producer surplus, they don't get to keep 60. They have to pay, that consumer hands over $60. They then have to pay the tax. So they get the amount the consumers pay minus the tax, so 40. So the new producer surplus would be this area down here. this triangle 30 times 30 times a half. Here's an example where what was the reduction in both producer and consumer surplus? It was the exact same amount. They would have the exact same elasticity measure. They're bearing the burden of this tax equally. So the loss of surplus would also tell you who's bearing more of the burden of that tax. In this case, they both had a reduction of the same amount, so they must be equally elastic or inelastic, right? They have the same elasticity measure. What does that green area represent to us? Well, this is not a loss of surplus. This is the value of the tax. So in this case, what would the value of the tax be? Well, if the price the consumer pays is 60, price the seller keeps is 40, the value of the tax must be $20. If 30 units are being sold after the tax, 30 times 20, that's how much tax revenue is generated, or the government's getting 600. Okay. Now, once again, we can calculate deadweight loss as this little triangle here. The loss of surplus from the fact that we're no longer seeing the units from 30 to 40 being sold. So the difference between our supply and demand curve there, we could calculate what? The area of this triangle, 20 times 10 times a half, which would be 100. Or I could look at what was total surplus before. So before it was just consumer plus producer surplus, so 1600. After the tax, what is total surplus? It's not 900, right? It's not just producer plus consumer surplus. It'd be producer plus consumer surplus plus government surplus or tax revenue. So 450 plus 600, that would give us 1500. So total surplus went from 1600 to 1500, or our deadweight loss, the loss of surplus is $100. Okay. Any other questions on that before we keep moving here? Oops. All right. So where are we at time-wise? So we'll go through this here relatively quickly. So we've talked about ways in which we can identify or thinking about who's going to bear more or less of the burden of a tax. When we think about how much tax revenue is generated, we can kind of go back to thinking about our example of perfectly inelastic demand. There we go. So with perfectly inelastic demand, we said, what is deadweight loss? Well, the same quantity is being sold before and after the tax, so deadweight loss was 0. So when you have a consumer base that is perfectly inelastic, this would represent tax revenue, right? And you're not seeing any reduction in quantity, you have 0 deadweight loss. So this is going to be this trade-off between deadweight loss and tax revenue. The more elastic that demand becomes, well, if we go back to, where is it at? Perfectly, somewhere in here. Oh, where did I put it? Well, I know we did it somewhere in here earlier. Perfectly elastic. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So when we had perfectly elastic demand, what were we getting from that same tax? Well, now deadweight loss is going to be relatively large, and we're going to have not quite as much tax revenue. Okay. So there's this trade-off between elasticities, when demand is more or less elastic, between deadweight loss and total revenue. So we think about like a small tax, right? Even if we don't have perfectly inelastic or perfectly elastic demand, a small tax is going to generate not a lot of deadweight loss and a decent amount of tax revenue. If I increase the tax, yes, I can get more tax revenue, but I'm also going to get more deadweight loss. And then if I continue to make the tax even larger, we'll notice at some point, tax revenues might actually not be going up, and I'm causing a lot of deadweight loss. You know, if I'm thinking about the government kind of imposing these taxes, what happens if I start to create a lot of deadweight loss? Well, maybe my populace becomes very upset, right? Maybe there's other markets that are impacted by the unhappiness of my people. So there's always this trade-off between tax revenue and then larger the tax. Yes, I might be able to generate more tax revenue from every unit sold, but I'm also creating more deadweight loss. Okay, so there's always kind of this balance between the two. So some of the kind of summary of just all this idea of taxes, and this is not going to be something where you really get a lot of questions on, but just to kind of start thinking a little bit harder about, okay, small taxes, although they might not generate as much tax revenue, what if I could generate the same tax revenue from a small tax as I could from a large tax? So let's say those green areas were the same, but with a small tax, I'm generating a lot less deadweight loss. That seems like that would be the optimal tax for the government to impose. Okay. So some of the things that we've talked about with taxes here, just to kind of summarize, it doesn't matter. We started out, if I tax consumers or producers, I still end up with the same resulting impacts on consumer or producer surplus and tax revenue. Who's going to bear more of the burden of the tax, or who is going to have a larger decrease in their surplus, producers or consumers? Basically, whoever is more inelastic will bear more of the burden. We also kind of talked about with elasticities, how can I generate the most revenue? Well, this is going to be when we had perfectly inelastic demand, that we were keeping quantity the same, and we have this huge tax revenue. So we want to tax products where we think that demand and supply are relatively inelastic. And then this deadweight loss, right? That is also going to be related to elasticity. We said when we have perfectly elastic demand, or sorry, perfectly inelastic demand, we had no deadweight loss, right? So the more elastic, we're going to have larger amounts of deadweight loss. I kind of just saying that in the opposite direction. And then there's this kind of trade-off between tax revenues and deadweight loss. The larger the tax, I'm creating more deadweight loss, even if it does generate a little bit more tax revenue, right? It might, it's coming at a cost of the fact that I'm losing more surplus in that market. Okay. And we'll go through some questions in the quiz or participation quiz today that kind of talks about, looks at these different things as well. So kind of a, I don't know, somewhat of a fun example. I'd say it's fun. So there was a tax in Ireland, right? If the purpose of our tax is to gain tax revenues, they thought there's this great idea of like, and we'll talk more about externalities in the next module, but if I tax a product, if demand isn't perfectly inelastic, all of these different graphs we've been looking at, what's happened to quantity? Quantity has been going down. Right? So when we see this decrease in quantity from a tax, maybe we want to tax things that we don't want people to use as much of. So cigarettes, and here Ireland thought plastic bags, right? There are all these plastic bags from like grocery stores end up in the landfill. And so let's start taxing these plastic bags. So they thought, we might see a reduction in quantity, but also we could generate some tax revenue. Well, the problem is when they taxed plastic bags, use fell by 90%. So what must have been pretty true about the demand for plastic bags? When the price went up for consumers, they bought a lot less. So they were very responsive or very elastic, right? Well, if a product is very elastic, how much money are we actually making? Well, if this is reduced to zero, we could actually have a situation where we don't make any money, right? If consumers are completely responsive, they go from buying something to nothing, right? When you tax this product, potentially you make no tax revenue, right? So here they had this idea of maybe the purpose of a tax isn't always to generate tax revenues. They didn't make a lot of revenue off these plastic bag taxes, but what did they do? They decreased the quantity a lot. Now, the market for plastic bags, those consumers and producers probably didn't like that, but what did we get rid of? A lot of pollution. Okay. So sometimes the goal of taxes is not just to generate revenue, it may be to just limit quantity. Okay. No questions there. So cursing, only one bad word, taxes, right? Hurts both producers and consumers, causes deadweight loss. In general, we don't like them. If I'm in a market, we don't like to see a tax in that market. Okay. So we've got what, 25 minutes. So we'll now kind of go through and talk about subsidies. So I've got some graphs in the slides, but I think I can make this make, I don't know, I always like to do subsidies by hand first because it's a little bit trickier. And here I've got the way that I want you to think about subsidies, and if we have time, I'll draw it out the other way. It's kind of like taxes. It doesn't matter who I give a subsidy to. So what is a subsidy? It's an amount of money given to either a producer or a consumer for consuming or buying something or for producing it. So we think about supply represents marginal costs to the producers, demand marginal benefit. Here would be my initial equilibrium price and quantity, okay? So I'm not going to add it into the graph just to muddy up, but you can kind of think about, just like all these other models, consumer surplus is this triangle, producer surplus down here. Okay? So if I'm giving people money to do something, you can, just like a tax on producers or consumers, you can give a subsidy to either one. If I was drawing this out, I would always draw a subsidy out because we'll get the same implications no matter who we give the subsidy to. I would always think about it as a subsidy to consumers, because if I give people money from buying something, their marginal benefit is whatever it was before plus the value of that subsidy. So at every single quantity, the marginal benefit will be whatever it was before plus this subsidy. So just like we had the demand or supply curve or demand curve plus the tax, here it's going to be the demand curve plus the subsidy. Well, tax was an additional cost. Here, this is an additional benefit. Right? So where is our new kind of equilibrium point going to be? Notice with a subsidy, the price that we might initially think about this is the new price in the market. This is not the price, right, that consumers are going to pay. Right? So if I think about this as is the price in the market, what's the total benefit to consumers? It's no longer going to be, I want to say this. So we've got, so I can think about it here, this might be right. This is the price in the market, right? So this is how much money the consumer hands over or is willing to hand over to the company. But what does the consumer actually pay? Well, it's this amount, but part of that price is the subsidy. So the price that the seller actually keeps now will be up here, and the price that the consumer is paying, in essence, is now going to be down here. So it's kind of the reverse of taxes, and it gets a little bit goofy because the new market price will not be the price the consumer pays. That's going to be the total price the seller keeps. And then the total kind of value to the consumer that they pay will be whatever they hand over to the company minus whatever that subsidy that was given to them, right? Because that was an additional amount of money they now kind of have in their pocket, if you think about it that way. So this demand curve is not what we use to calculate consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is using the actual demand curve and not the old equilibrium price, but the new price that consumers are going to pay. So notice before, when it was just this triangle, now consumer surplus is this entire area, right? So kind of that consumer surplus after the subsidy. Consumer surplus has actually went up. Where is producer surplus? Well, before it was this triangle here. What's the new price sellers keep? It's up here. So the difference between that and their supply curve will be this area. So notice with a subsidy, what happened to the quantity we saw sold in the market? It actually went up. So we've got some overlap now that we didn't have in these tax revenue or these tax examples. So you can kind of see, like here I've got red and blue shade area. It's almost like this is being double counted. Right? But this was what total surplus was before. So there's going to be an area that was double counted. So there was a gain of surplus there. There was also a gain of surplus from these areas. Okay? So we might say, oh, that's great. We just saw an increase in producer and consumer surplus. So anytime we have a subsidy, producer surplus goes up, consumer surplus is also going to go up. The problem is total surplus hasn't went up. Because with taxes, we had an additional person we had to add in, which was the government revenue, right? if the government is paying money for something to be consumed or produced, what do we now have? We now have a government expenditure, right? What's the total expenditure? Well, it's going to be the difference between the price the seller keeps and the price the consumer pays, or the value of that subsidy. So we would take the value of the subsidy, multiply that by the quantity we see in the market after the subsidy. This is now going to be an additional cost in the market. So when we add this in, this would represent a negative value. So I've got it in the slides so that if you're trying to kind of recreate this, it's very difficult to do on one graph. That's why I'm trying to use colors. What is representing the value of the subsidy? So that would be the difference between these prices. The quantity after the subsidy. Oh, this rectangle in the middle, this would represent my government expenditure. Notice this area that got double counted, it's being washed out by this additional government expenditure. The areas gained by producers and consumers here also kind of canceled out. And what we're left with is this little triangle over here, which represents where the marginal cost for every quantity in this range is below the consumer's marginal benefit. So subsidies encourage overproduction. The overproduction past that equilibrium point, now that supply is above the demand curve, this is going to represent the surplus lost from every single one of these additional units. So our deadweight loss is now going to be kind of this triangle on this outer right edge. So once again, it's a little bit kind of tricky. I think it's definitely tougher than taxes, right? So I've got another depiction in the slides that I think with the animations might help a little bit, okay? Excuse me. So in general, without all of these additional things drawn in, so let's say I have a market that's in equilibrium. I could actually also subsidize the producers so that just like a subsidy to consumers increases demand, a subsidy to producers increases supply. So I can get the exact same effect. So here, this new equilibrium price, this lower price is going to be the price that the consumer pays or the price that we see in the market. So you can draw it as an increase in demand or an increase in supply, and you still get that this price that the consumer pays is going to be below whatever the old equilibrium price is. Okay. Once again, intuitively, think about it this way. With taxes, we saw the price that the consumer paid relative to the old equilibrium went up. The price the seller kept went down relative to the old equilibrium. With a subsidy, because this is going to benefit both producers and consumers, the price that the consumer pays will go down. Well, what does the seller get to keep? If the consumer gives them $400 and then the government gives them the value of the subsidy, which here must be what? $200. The price that the seller keeps is going to be higher, right? So it's benefited both the producer and the consumer. What is our deadweight loss? Well, it's the difference between our supply and demand curve, where our marginal costs were greater than our marginal benefits for all of these additional units that are now being produced and consumed past that old allocative efficient or old equilibrium point. So this is kind of how to think about deadweight loss without all of the additional surpluses drawn in. Okay. So before, if we didn't have a subsidy, we have consumer and producer surplus here. Okay. So let's say I have a subsidy to producers that's going to increase supply. The new price the consumer pays is lower. Price that the seller keeps is higher. Where is the new producer and consumer surplus? Well, consumer surplus, the area below the demand curve, but above the new price they pay, will be this entire triangle. Notice, what was consumer surplus before? Just this little triangle. So it's went up by quite a bit, right? What about producer surplus? Well, the area below the price they're now getting to keep above their supply curve is now this area. What was it before? It was just this little triangle, right? So consumer and producer surplus have now increased. Right? There's going to be an area here where they overlap, right? So that area is being double counted, right? But then they have this additional gain that we can kind of see up here. However, what is the government expenditure? It's going to be the new quantity after the subsidy times the value of that subsidy. So this would represent an additional cost. This yellow area would wash out this additional gain, wash out the area that was being double counted. So we're going to be left with just whatever surplus we had before, but what area isn't getting canceled out, this white area here, that's going to be an additional cost. That's why that represents our deadweight loss. Okay. So kind of here, that green area would be our deadweight loss. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of move to go through those quiz questions? And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I might do some additional drawing out these subsidies in a slightly different way. So any questions there before we move to that participation quiz? Okay. Nope, I don't want to stop share. I want to go to Canvas and want to go to participation quiz. We'll kind of work through these. Right. So this first one, right? I've got a depiction. What is producer surplus after the tax? So I told you the value of the tax here. If I think about, here's my supply curve. First of all, who must have been taxed in this example? Well, if the supply curve was shifting, it must have been a tax on producers. What is the value of the tax? It's just the difference between that supply curve and the supply curve with the tax at any quantity. So 60 to 85, the value must have been 25. Now I could also look at, after the tax, what's the new price in the market where the new supply curve hits the demand curve. So this is going to be at 70. However, that's the price the consumer pays. The price the seller keeps is that amount minus the tax. So the difference between the price the seller keeps, 45, price the consumer pays, 70, that difference is 25. So if I want to calculate producer surplus, the new price that they keep is only 45. The area below that, but above their supply curve, would be this triangle here. So that's what? 35 times 35 times a half should give me 612.5. Right? So just the area of this lower triangle, which I'm doing the right, 10 to 45, so 35 times 0 to 35, 35 times a half, that would give us our producer surplus. Okay. What if instead I was asked about how much tax revenue is generated? Tax revenue should be an easier one. It's just going to be this, this is a less technical way of remembering it. It's this big rectangle in the middle. Okay. So here, what is the width of this rectangle? It's the new quantity after the tax, 35. What's the height of this rectangle? Well, remember, that was the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps. So that was the value of the tax. The value of the tax times the quantity of the tax, that's just tax revenue. So what? 25 times 35 should give me 875. Any questions on that one? It's not too bad. What if I wanted to figure out what deadweight loss is? Okay. So let me think about a trickier way I could do this. Let's say I didn't even give you a depiction, right? So I could actually tell you that the value of the tax was $25. Okay. And if I told you the old equilibrium quantity was, and I'll make sure these, let me make sure these match up with what's on here. So, okay. Was 50. And after the tax, the new equilibrium quantity after the tax is 35. Okay. How could you tell me, just from this information, you should always be able to calculate deadweight loss, right? So let's think about why. If I've got any good and I'm thinking about it's being taxed. So I think the one that I had in the quiz, I had a tax on producers, but I'm just going to show you, it could be a tax on consumers as well. So a tax on consumers, we said did what? It actually decreased demand. So with taxes on consumers, it'll decrease demand. Producers, it'll decrease supply. Subsidies increased either one. Right? So now that I've got this new equilibrium point, this is going to be the price that, well, what should it do? A tax should decrease the price that sellers keep. What's the price that consumers pay? Would be the price that sellers keep plus the tax. So notice, what will the height of this triangle always be? The difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps, that will also always just be the value of the tax. What is the width of this triangle always going to be? It'll always be the old equilibrium quantity and the new quantity after the tax. So if I tell you these two, the difference is what? 15. So how would I find the area of dead weight loss, the area in between supply and demand from all these units no longer being produced? This is just going to be the value of the tax times, well, here will be negative, but, right? And then it's always times 1/2. So if I take this here, it should be what? 50 times 15 times 1/2. Sure enough, even if it was the same tax, if I go ahead and compute that, I should get 187.5. That's exactly what I would get if that tax was also on the producers. Notice, what would the height of this triangle always be? The value of the tax of 25. What's the width? The reduction in quantity of 15. And then it's a triangle, so always times 1/2. So I could actually give you those values, and that dead weight loss, that triangle always represents the value of the tax times the number of units reduced by the tax, and then times 1/2. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. And then the last one, so if you have a subsidy given to producers, right, which of the following is not true about the market for oil relative to when there are no subsidies, okay? So we're thinking about what's happening to the price that the consumer pays, what's happening to the quantity, what's happening to consumer and producer surplus. So with subsidies, just to kind of give you another depiction, so the depiction in the slides was giving these subsidies to producers. Right? If instead I gave you subsidies where got supply, demand, right? Here's the old equilibrium quantity. Here's kind of the old equilibrium price. We would have producer and consumer surplus here. Okay? If I gave this subsidy instead to producers, so with producers, it shifted supply out. We said, what if they gave it to consumers? It would just increase demand. Well, we can still identify where that new quantity is going to be after the subsidy. Okay. So what's happened to the quantity after the subsidy? Quantity has went up. Okay. This price now represents the total value, or the kind of the price that the seller gets to keep. The price that the consumer pays will be that amount. And what's the difference here? Minus that subsidy, right? So the price that consumers pay goes down. They're buying more units. What definitely has to happen to consumer surplus? It's went from this area here. Well, here's the new price they pay all the way out to this quantity to now this, right? So consumer surplus has went up. Right? What about producer surplus? Before the subsidy, it was here. After the subsidy, the new higher price, it's this entire area. So producer surplus has also went up. However, what have we created? Even though it looks like we have a gain to both producers and consumers, we have this huge government expenditure, which washed out those gains and created an additional loss in that market. So we're going to have some deadweight loss as well. Okay. So, can you go back? Yeah, I'll go back to question 3 here in a second. So we saw producer and consumer surplus increase. So this one is not true. That's the one we're looking for, is not true. The market price, or the price that the consumer pays, that actually went down. And then the quantity in the market, we said, would also go up. So the price that the seller keeps goes up. The price the consumer pays goes down. That's going to benefit both producers and consumers. So we'll see their surplus go up. What's happening to total surplus? This wasn't one of the possible options, but total surplus, because we've created deadweight loss, total surplus is actually going down. Okay. And then question 3, right? If we take the height, that was the value of the tax, 25, times the reduction in quantity of 15, 25 times 15, it's a triangle, so times a half, should give us that 187.5. Okay. Any other questions on any of those participation quiz problems? Okay. Okay, so that should finish us out for modules 5 and 6, focusing a lot on surpluses, government actions. I will get that quiz posted as soon as I get back to my office. That'll be due by the end of the day Sunday. I would suggest probably trying to get on sooner rather than later to get it done, but I also understand you might want some time to review the materials. So I would make sure, as with all these quizzes, review those practice problems, the solutions, and then we will start module 7 tomorrow. So that module 7 reading is due before we start class tomorrow. So this is where those of you who are live probably don't kind of tune me out. Getting some emails about the module 5 reading. It was not due. I was very specific in saying that it was only module 6, right? I think I even posted it in this module readings this week announcement, but it was only module 6 that was due today. Because we're starting module 7 tomorrow, that's going to be the one that's due before we start class tomorrow. Okay. You'll have all of module 7 materials already up there. So we'll kind of start with those slides in class tomorrow. Other than that, I will also set to release the module 8 reading, right? That'll be due before we start class on Friday. And that should kind of cover everything. Unless there's any questions for me, kind of end the recording here.